restaurant was Daniel's choice, a place called Meridian in downtown Cleveland, the kind of place where the menu does not list prices for the specials, and the sommelier introduces himself by his first name and then waits. He said it with the tone of a man explaining a geographic fact, not a criticism, not an attack, a fact. He said, "The people in my life, the work I do, the environment I operate in, it's not something I can really translate for someone who hasn't lived it." He said, "I think sometimes you don't realize how much things have changed since you were working." Since you were working? I looked at my son across the table. My son, the physician, in his good suit at his restaurant, with his sommelier and his girlfriend, and his hands that had never built anything you could put weight on. My son, whose tuition I had paid with a home equity loan and 22 years of retirement savings. My son, who had signed a document in Bob Chisholm's office in the summer of 2016, acknowledging a debt of $212,000 and agreeing to repay it at terms to be determined by mutual agreement. I smiled. I raised my hand for the waiter. I said, "Could we get the check, please?" Susan was watching me. She knows me the way daughters know fathers, when the fathers have not hidden much over the years, and the daughters have been paying attention. She knew something had shifted. She looked at her plate. I paid the check. $263 plus tip, which I calculated at 22%, because I was an assembly line worker for 7 years, and then a foreman, and then a plant manager, and I know that the person carrying the plates does not set the prices and should not carry the cost of them. I said good night. I hugged my son. I shook Alexis's hand. I kissed Susan on the cheek, and she held my arm for a moment at the door and said, "Dad, just my name." I said, "I know, Susan, I know." I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table where Miriam and I ate 31 years of dinners. I made coffee. I looked at the clock, which said 8:47. I thought about the document in Bob Chisholm's office. Then I called Bob's cell phone, which he has told me I am always welcome to use, and I left a message. I said, "Bob, it's George Hartley. I need to talk to you in the morning about the Hartley note. I think it's time to activate it. Let me tell you the whole story. Start from the beginning. My name is George Hartley. I am 57 years old. I spent 32 years in automotive manufacturing, 7 on the line, 11 as a shift foreman, 14 as a plant manager at a facility in Lorain, Ohio, that made transmission components for 3 domestic manufacturers and employed 340 people at its peak. I retired in 2021 when the plant restructured, and I was given a package that, combined with my pension and my savings, made retirement the reasonable choice. My wife Miriam died 4 years ago. She was 53. She had been a pediatric nurse for 26 years, and she died of the same breast cancer she had helped other people's families navigate for most of her career, which is the kind of irony that doesn't get easier the more you think about it. So eventually, you stop thinking about it and just keep the photograph on the kitchen counter where you can see it from the coffee maker. Daniel is my son. He is 31 years old. He has my height and Miriam's intelligence, which means he got the better of the arrangement. And he has been a licensed physician for 8 months, a hospitalist at a teaching hospital in Cleveland. The thing Miriam and I spent 13 years and $212,000 making possible. Susan is my daughter. She is 34. She is a registered nurse, same as her mother, has been for 9 years, works nights in the cardiac ICU in Akron, because she says nights are where the real work happens, and Susan has always been drawn to the real work. She put herself through nursing school on loans and a part-time job at a hotel front desk, and she graduated with debt she paid off herself in 4 years, because that is the kind of person she is and has always been. I want to tell you more about Miriam before I tell you what changed in the year after Daniel became an attending, because the two things are connected in a way that took me a while to understand. Miriam used to say that the most dangerous thing you could do for a child was protect them from the weight of things. She said this as a nurse and as a mother, and she applied it the same way in both roles. When Daniel was 7 and wanted a bicycle, and we could not quite afford the one he wanted, she did not find a way to get it for him. She made him wait, and she told him exactly why he was waiting, and she let him feel the waiting. When he was 15 and failed a chemistry test because he had not studied, she did not call the school. She let him fail, and then she sat with him and went through every problem he had gotten wrong, until he understood each one. She said, "Daniel, you have to know what went wrong before you can fix it. Telling you it's fine would be a lie." She was not a hard woman. She was a precise one. She understood that kindness and honesty were not opposites, that the kindest thing you could do for the people you loved was tell them the truth about what things cost and what things were worth, and what the difference between those two things was. I thought about this often in the year after Daniel finished residency. That was the year I noticed the change. He had always called regularly. Through medical school, through residency, the calls were frequent, sometimes quick, always warm. He called from hospital parking lots, and from the call room at 2 in the morning, and from airport gates during away rotations. He called the way you call when you are in the middle of something hard and the person on the other end of the phone is part of what is getting you through it. After residency, after the attending position, the calls became less frequent, not dramatically, gradually, from 3 times a week to twice, from twice to once. The conversations became shorter, and the tone shifted in a way I noticed but could not immediately name. It was a formal quality, like talking to someone who was giving you a summary of their life rather than their life itself. He stopped asking about the house. He stopped asking about the neighborhood, about Carl next door, about the garden that Miriam used to keep, and that I have been maintaining in the imperfect but sincere way of a man who knows that some things are worth keeping even when you are not the person who was best at keeping them. He started talking about his colleagues the way people talk about colleagues when they want you to understand the world they have entered, the names of the physicians, the politics of the hospital, the conference he was presenting at. He talked about Alexis, about the apartment they were considering, about a vacation he was planning in Europe. He used the word lifestyle twice in a single call in September, which is a word Miriam used to say was a warning sign. She said, "George, the day someone starts talking about their lifestyle is the day they have started thinking about their life as a product rather than a life." She was usually right about these things. By October, I had named the quality. It was distance, not cruelty, not ingratitude. Distance, the specific distance that grows between people when one of them has entered a new world and has started, gradually and perhaps unconsciously, to measure the old world by the standards of the new one. He was not dismissing me. He was calibrating me. He was figuring out where I fit in the new map, and on the new map, I was fitting in the category of background. Context. The story of where you came from, that explains you to people but doesn't travel with you. The restaurant was just the moment that made the calibration audible. Since you were working, I heard that sentence and I thought about Miriam's yellow legal pad, and I thought about 8 years of monthly payments on a home equity loan, and I thought about a young man sitting at a kitchen table in 2016 who signed a document that said $212,000 and went back to his room to pack for school. And I raised my hand for the waiter. Miriam Hartley grew up in a family that had nothing in the specific way that families have nothing. When the nothing has been present for generations and everyone has simply organized their expectations around it. Her father worked shifts at a paper mill. Her mother cleaned houses. Miriam worked as a waitress from the time she was 15 and put herself through nursing school at the same community college where I had taken 2 semesters of business courses, which is how we met, in a parking lot in 1989, when I asked if she needed a jump for a car with a dead battery. And she said yes, and we talked for 40 minutes waiting for the battery to charge. She worked for 26 years in the pediatric unit, and she was the best nurse in every room she ever stood in. And she made more in those years than her parents made in their whole lives combined, and she was as proud of that as anything I have ever seen a person be proud of. When Daniel came home from his first year of college and said he wanted to be a doctor, Miriam was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We are going to figure out how to make that happen." She said it the way she said things she had already decided, not as a discussion, as an announcement of the outcome, pending the work. We sat at the kitchen table that night after Daniel had gone to bed, and we ran the numbers. Miriam had a yellow legal pad. She was always the one with the legal pad. The numbers were not kind. Medical school was going to cost all in somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000 for the 4 years, depending on the school and the cost of living and whether Daniel got any scholarship money, which he did not because his grades, while good, were not exceptional, and scholarships at that level require exceptional. I said, "How do we do it?" Miriam said, "We use a house." The house was paid off. We had bought it in 1994 for $94,000, and it was worth in 2016, when Daniel started medical school, approximately $230,000. We had $72,000 in savings outside of retirement accounts. The plan was a home equity loan for $140,000, plus the $72,000 in savings, which got us to $212,000 and covered the 4 years with a modest buffer for emergencies. I said, "What about our retirement?" She said, "We have our pensions, mine from the hospital, yours from the plant. We'll be fine." She said, "George, he's going to be a doctor." She said it the way she said things she knew to be true, not triumphant. "Certain." I said, "Miriam, if something happens, if things go sideways, if he can't or won't pay it back." She said, "Then he owes his father a debt that he will carry until he does." She said, "We are not giving him this money. We are lending it to him, and he is going to know that." That is how Bob Chisholm got involved. Bob Chisholm is 64 years old. He has been my attorney since 1999. When I needed someone to review a contract dispute at the plant, and a colleague recommended him. He is a careful man, methodical, the kind of attorney who takes 30 minutes to answer a question that could be answered in 5, because he wants to make sure the 5-minute answer does not have a 10-minute problem hiding behind it. He does not charge me for the extra 25 minutes, which is something I have noticed and never commented on. In the summer of 2016, Bob drew up a promissory note. It was a formal legal instrument documenting a loan from George and Miriam Hartley to Daniel Hartley in the amount of $212,000. It specified the principal. It specified that interest would accrue at 3% annually from the date of signing. It specified that repayment terms would be determined by mutual agreement between the parties no later than 12 months after Daniel completed his residency. It specified that in the absence of a repayment agreement, the full principal plus accrued interest would become immediately due. Daniel signed it. I want to tell you how that conversation went, because it matters for everything that comes after. We were at the kitchen table, same table where Miriam had run the numbers. She was there. Bob was there with the document. Daniel read it, which took 4 minutes, and when he finished, he looked up at me and said, "Dad, is this really necessary?" I said, "Daniel, your mother and I are taking a home equity loan on this house and using our savings to pay for your education. Yes, this is necessary." He said, "I know, but a formal note? Like I'm a stranger?" Miriam said, "Daniel, you are our son, not our charity." She said it gently, the way she said hard things. She said, "This is not because we don't trust you. This is because the money is real, and you should know it is real, and we should all know what it means." She said, "If you are going to be a doctor, you need to understand that real things have real instruments." He signed it. He was 22 years old, and he was leaving for medical school in 3 weeks. And I think the weight of the number $212,000 was abstract enough that the paper felt like a formality, which is exactly how it felt to him for the next 9 years. I made the payments on the home equity loan myself, every month for 8 years, out of my salary and then out of my pension. I made every payment. I never asked Daniel for a cent. He finished medical school. He matched into residency at a hospital in Cleveland. He worked 4 years of residency at a salary that barely covered his cost of living. And I said nothing about the note. He finished residency. He took an attending position. He started earning the salary that physicians earn in their first year as attendings, which is a number that would have taken me 8 years to earn at the plant. I still said nothing about the note. I want to be honest about why. I said nothing partly because of Miriam. She died in the 2nd year of Daniel's residency, and after she died, I found it very difficult to have any conversation that required me to think about the future in terms of what was owed or deserved or calculated. Grief does that. It makes the bookkeeping feel indecent for a while. But I also said nothing because I was proud, not of myself, of him. I had watched my son become a physician, and I had watched Miriam watch him become a physician for the first 3 years of it before she got sick. And the pride of that was so large that it occupied the space where the practical things lived, and I let it. I also said nothing, and this is the part that I have been most honest with myself about since Thanksgiving, because I was afraid of what pressing on the note might cost me. I was afraid that asking for the money would be the thing that changed the relationship from father and son into creditor and debtor, and I valued the relationship more than the money. That is the truth. I valued the relationship, and I did not fully understand until a Tuesday evening at Meridian Restaurant. that the relationship I was protecting was not quite what I had believed it to be. Daniel said, "The world I live in now is just very different from anything you've experienced. Since you were working?" I heard both sentences clearly. The first was condescension dressed as explanation. The second was the tell. Since you were working, not since you retired. Since you were working, as if the working were the past and the worth were attached to the working, and when the working ended, so did the relevance. I thought about the house equity loan. I thought about 32 years of shift work and plant management and the yellow legal pad and Miriam at the kitchen table saying we are not giving him this money, we are lending it. I thought about Bob Chisholm and the promissory note and 3% annual interest accruing since 2016. I raised my hand for the waiter. Bob called me back the next morning at 7:45. He is an early riser, which I have always appreciated. I explained the evening. He was quiet in the way he is quiet when he is converting what he has heard into its legal dimensions. He said, "George, the note is fully enforceable. The principal is $212,000. At 3% annual interest since August 2016, the accrued interest as of this month is approximately $51,000. The total obligation is approximately $263,000. I said, "I know." He said, "Daniel has never made a payment." I said, "I know." He said, "And the 12-month clock for establishing repayment terms started when he completed residency." Which was, I said, June of this year, 5 months ago. He said, "So you are within the window." I said, "Yes." Bob was quiet again. Then he said, "George, do you want me to send a formal notice of debt, or do you want to contact Daniel directly first?" I thought about this. I said, "Formal notice. I want it on paper before I say anything to him directly. I want him to have the document in his hands before we have the conversation, so that the conversation is about the document and not about whether the document is real." Bob said, "I will have it ready by end of week." I said, "Bob, one more thing." He said, "Yes." I said, "I need you to calculate what the house payments have cost me over 8 years and add that to the picture, not to the note, just so I have the number." He called me back Thursday afternoon. He said, "George, your total out-of-pocket cost over 8 years of HELOC payments, including interest on the loan itself, is approximately $187,000. He paused. He said, "So you have personally serviced roughly $187,000 of a debt that your son has been carrying on paper without ever making a payment." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you want that in a separate document?" I said, "Yes." Not a demand, just a summary for the conversation. Bob sent both documents the following Wednesday. The notice of debt activation, formal and precise, with the total obligation and the original note attached, and a one-page summary, just numbers, just what I had paid on his behalf over 8 years. I called Susan first. She deserved to know before I called Daniel, and she deserved to know from me and not from whatever version of events Daniel was going to offer when he found out. Susan answered on the first ring. She always answers on the first ring when I call, which I have noticed and never commented on, because some things you notice and keep. I told her about the note. I told her about the 8 years of payments. I told her the total numbers. She was quiet through all of it in the way she goes quiet at work, I imagine, when she is receiving information about a patient that she needs to understand completely before she responds to it. When I finished, she said, "Dad, "How long have you been thinking about doing this?" I said, "Since Thursday night." She said, "Since the restaurant?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What did he say exactly?" I told her the sentence. "The world I live in now is just very different from anything you've experienced." "Since you were working?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He said, since you were working." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not since you retired." "Since you were working?" I said, "Susan, I know." She made a sound I recognized from childhood, a small controlled exhale through the nose, the sound she makes when she has understood something she does not want to have understood. She said, "Dad, I want to say something, and I want you to let me say it all the way through." I said, "Say it." She said, "Daniel is not a bad person. I know that is not what this feels like right now, but it is true, and I want to say it because you raised us both, and I watched you raise him, and he is not a bad person. He is a person who has been in a very intense, very consuming environment for 9 years, and who has come out the other side of it changed in ways he probably does not fully see yet." She stopped. She said, "That does not make what he said okay. It does not mean you should not have done what you did. It means that when you talk to him, which you are going to have to do, there is something in there worth reaching for." I sat with that. I said, "I know there is. That is why I am not calling the note in full. I am starting a conversation, not ending a relationship." She said, "Okay." She said, "Do you need me to come up?" I said, "Not yet. Let me talk to him first." She said, "Call me after." I said, "I will." "Susan." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Your mother used to say you asked the best questions of anyone she knew." She said, "She told me that once." I said, "She told me every time." Daniel called me the day after the notice arrived. I know it arrived because I had asked Bob to send it with delivery confirmation, and Bob texted me when the confirmation came through. Daniel called at 11 in the morning on a Thursday. He called twice in a row, which is what he does when it is urgent, 2 calls back to back, which I knew from 31 years of being his father. I answered the second call. He said, "Dad." His voice was different from the restaurant, stripped of the sommelier and the good suit and the professional assurance. Something younger in it, something I recognized from years ago. I said, "Daniel." He said, "I got a letter from Bob Chisholm." I said, "I know." He said, $263,000. I said, "Principal plus interest at 3% since 2016. Bob's arithmetic is accurate." He said, "Dad, I signed that when I was 22. I said, "I know. It was a legal document. Age doesn't change what you signed." He said, "I thought it was a formality." I said, "Daniel, your mother told you in explicit terms that it was not a formality. I was there. Bob was there. She said, 'We are not giving him this money. We are lending it.' You were in that room." Silence. He said, "I don't have $263,000. I said, "I know. You're 8 months into your first attending position. You have student loans of your own. You have an apartment in Cleveland. You have a life that costs what it costs. I am not calling the note in full tomorrow morning." He said, "Then what are you doing?" I said, "I am starting a conversation that should have started 12 months ago when you completed residency. I am doing what the note says we were supposed to do, which is establish repayment terms." He was very quiet. I said, "Daniel, I want to tell you something. I am going to tell you 2 numbers, and I want you to sit with them." He said, "Okay." I said, "The first number is $212,000. That is what your mother and I borrowed and saved to pay for your education. That is the home equity loan on the house your mother and I bought in 1994. That is 22 years of savings that we did not spend on ourselves. That is what it cost to make you a physician. I paused. I said, the second number is $187,000. That is what I have personally paid in HELOC payments over the 8 years since you started medical school. That is my money, out of my salary and my pension every month for 8 years, paying down a debt I took on for you that you have never once asked about. I said, I am not telling you these numbers to make you feel guilty. I am telling them to you because you told me at Thanksgiving that I couldn't understand your world. I want you to understand mine. The silence that followed was the longest of the phone call. Then Daniel said, I didn't know you were still making payments. I said, I know you didn't. That is part of the point. He said, I thought it was handled, I thought. He stopped. I said, you thought I had figured it out, and you didn't ask, because asking would have required you to think about what it cost me. That is not an accusation. It is an observation. He said, Dad, I said, when your mother was making the yellow legal pad calculations at the kitchen table in 2016, she said something to me when you went to bed. She said, George, he doesn't understand what this costs yet. She said, he will. She said, not because we will make him understand, but because life has a way of making things clear eventually. I said, your mother was not wrong about very much. Daniel said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, what do you want from me? I said, I want 2 things. I want a repayment plan that is real and documented and that we both sign. Not a formality this time, a plan. A number every month for as many years as it takes that reflects what you can actually manage and that shows me you understand what this number is. He said, and the second thing, I said, I want you to come to dinner, not a restaurant you choose to impress people, here, at this table, where your mother used to sit with her yellow legal pad. I want to sit across from you at this table, and I want you to tell me what's going on in your life. Not the version you perform at a nice restaurant, the real version. And I want to tell you what's going on in mine. He was quiet. He said, okay. He said, Dad, I'm sorry about what I said at Thanksgiving. I said, I know. He said, I don't know why I said it. I said, Daniel, I think you said it because you have spent 9 years becoming something extraordinary, and you have been carrying the weight of that in a way that has made you forget where the ground is. That is not unusual. But the ground is still there, and it still has my name on it. He said, I know. He came to dinner the following Sunday. He drove himself, no Alexis, which told me he understood what kind of dinner it was. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair he has sat in since he was 4 years old. I made the pot roast that Miriam taught me in 1993, the first thing she ever taught me to cook, the one that takes 4 hours and is better the longer you let it go. She used to say that most good things are better the longer you let them go, which I have found to be true about food and about certain conversations and about the particular patience of waiting for a person to find their way back to you. The pot roast takes 4 hours. I had started it before noon. Daniel came in at 6. He looked tired. Not the restaurant tired, not the managed professional fatigue, real tired. The kind that lives behind the eyes and doesn't have anything to do with the night before. He said, it smells like Mom. I said, same recipe. He sat down. I poured him coffee. He held it with both hands the way he used to hold things when he was a child, wrapping the whole cup. And I thought about Miriam, who used to do the same thing, and about the specific ways children carry their parents without knowing it. I did not start with a note. I started with the pot roast, and I started with a question. I said, "Tell me about a patient you've lost." He looked up. I said, "Not for any reason. I just want to know what that is like for you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he talked. He talked about a woman, 61 years old, who had come in with what looked like a manageable presentation and had deteriorated overnight in a way that nobody had fully predicted. He talked about standing at the nurse's station at 4 in the morning and writing the note in the chart. He talked about calling the family. He talked about the drive home. He said, "I have done it 11 times in 8 months." I said, "That is the number you carry." He said, "Yes." I said, "Daniel, your mother was a nurse for 26 years in a pediatric unit. She carried those numbers too. She didn't talk about them often, but when she did, I would sit at this table and listen, and I would not try to fix it because it was not fixable. It was just weight, and the weight was part of the work." He said, "I know." I said, "I think the reason you started talking about your world as if nobody outside it could understand it is because the weight is real, and you didn't know how to carry it in a room where people weren't carrying the same thing. I think you built a wall around it, and then the wall became the presentation, and eventually you forgot what was inside." He looked at me. He said, He stopped. He said, "That's probably right." I said, "I'm not a physician. I am not going to pretend I understand what you do the way someone who does it understands it, but I spent 32 years managing a plant where people got hurt and sometimes worse, and I know what it is to carry the weight of other people's safety, and I know what it costs, and I am not so far outside your world that I cannot see that." He said, "I know, Dad. I know that. I said something stupid at that dinner." I said, "You said something that was true to how you'd been thinking, and I think knowing that matters more than knowing it was stupid." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." We ate for a while. Then he said, "Tell me about when you were on the line, the assembly line. I've never really asked you what that was like." So I told him. I told him about the line, the rhythm of it, the specific muscle memory of work that repeats itself, the way you could talk to the man next to you about anything because your hands were doing something else. I told him about the foreman years, the union negotiations, the nights when something went wrong on the line and you had to figure out fast whether it was mechanical or human and what to do about it either way. I told him about the plant manager years and the restructuring and the day I sat in the conference room and they told me about the package and I drove home and sat in this kitchen and thought about what Miriam would have said. He listened the way he used to listen in the car on the way to his games. We established repayment terms at the kitchen table after dinner. Bob Chisholm was not there, but I had asked Bob to prepare a simple framework, a monthly payment, a reasonable amount given Daniel's current income and his own loan obligations, with a balloon provision if his financial circumstances improved significantly. We looked at it together, and Daniel made one request for a modification of the first-year amount, which was reasonable, and I agreed to it, and we shook hands. Bob will have the formal document ready next week. Daniel will sign it. Not a formality this time. Susan called Sunday night, after Daniel left, the way she said she would. I told her how it went. She was quiet in the way she goes quiet when something has resolved the way she hoped, but she was not certain it would. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I am better than I have been since Thanksgiving." She said, That's a low bar. I said, "It is, but it counts." She laughed, the same laugh she has had since she was 9, her mother's pitch. I sat at the kitchen table after the call. The pot roast pan was soaking in the sink. Miriam's photograph was on the counter. The yellow legal pad from 2016 is not still here. I did not keep it, but I know what it said because I have run those numbers in my head enough times that they are as clear as anything I have ever written down. My father worked at a foundry in Pittsburgh for 38 years. He used to say, "George, the best thing you can give a man is not money. It is the understanding of what money cost." He said, if a man knows what something cost, he can decide what it is worth. If he doesn't know, he can't. I gave my son an education worth $212,000. I gave it to him correctly, with a promissory note and a signature, and a mother who sat at a table and said, "We are not giving him this money. We are lending it." I gave him the cost because the cost is the thing that makes it real. He forgot the cost for 9 years. On a Thursday in November, I reminded him. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I smiled at a restaurant table and raised my hand for the waiter and paid $263 for a dinner that cost considerably more than that. And I drove home, and I called Bob Chisholm, and I said, "It is time to activate the note." Miriam was right. Life has a way of making things clear eventually. My son is a physician. He is going to pay his debt. He is going to understand what it costs to become what he is, and he is going to sit at this kitchen table and eat pot roast and tell me the real version of his life, and I am going to tell him the real version of mine, and that is worth more than any number I could put in a promissory note. But the promissory note matters too. Your mother said so. From a table in this kitchen with a yellow legal pad in 2016, when you were 22 and leaving, and the world was very large and very bright, and you had not yet understood what everything underneath it had cost. She was usually right about these things. She was right about this one.